What's going on, everybody? Cleepus Tech here, coming back at you with another video. In this video, I'm going to be giving you my full review of the TCL 4X 5G and going over everything you need to know about it to help you decide whether or not it's the right phone for you. Now, before we go any further, as always, I do want to remind you to hit that subscribe button. And if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But with that being said, let's get into it. Now, the first thing that really comes to mind with this phone is that for the money, it's actually a surprisingly good deal. I personally got this phone for around $80 on sale at Target, and even at full price, it goes for just under $150. So in general, it's a really inexpensive phone. But honestly, for such an entry-level kind of price, we are actually getting quite a bit of value here. For the display, this phone has a 6.52-inch LCD display with a 720p resolution, a PPI of 320, and an aspect ratio of 20:9. So sure, on one hand, it's really nothing fancy. It's not like we're getting an AMOLED display or a 1080p resolution or a super high refresh rate or anything like that. But for what it is, things do look really good. I mean, keep in mind, seeing as this is a TCL phone, their phones do tend to have really good looking displays. So despite only having a 720p resolution, things do look nice and sharp, the colors look great, and for just a regular LCD display, even the viewing angles are actually pretty good. But that being said though, just keep in mind, if you're outside in the sun, for example, or in a really super bright area, it might not be quite as easier to see as a higher end device. But again, in general, for what it is really nice. Aside from the image quality, at 6.52 inches, it is decently large, so if you're consuming a lot of content, you will get a pretty good experience. And with the 20:9 aspect ratio, we're getting a pretty tall and narrow form factor, so if you're doing something like playing a game in landscape mode, for example, you are going to get a pretty immersive experience. And for something vertical like browsing the web, using social media, stuff like that, you can fit more content on the screen without having to scroll as much. So in general, while again, it's really nothing extraordinary, for what it is, I do think the TCL 4X 5G does have a great display. Now for storage, this phone is getting 64GB of internal storage with microSD card expansion, so on one hand, compared to pretty much any other price range, it's not really the greatest, but considering that again, this phone goes for around $150 and even less than $100 on sale, phones in this price range typically don't have a lot of storage. I mean, I just made a few videos on some really low-end Cricket phones, and all of them only had 32GB, and they were really around the price of this phone. So considering that, sure, if this were a $300 phone, I would consider the storage kind of low, but for a $150 phone, 64GB is actually pretty impressive. So in general, for the average user, as long as you're mindful of what you're putting on your phone, and you make sure to use a microSD card whenever you can, the storage you get with this phone should be perfectly fine for you. Now for security features, this phone does have face unlock, and it also has a fingerprint scanner right here on the back, so definitely nice to get both options, because while this is more or less an expectation in a higher price range, for entry-level phones, some only have one or the other, and of course, having more options to unlock your phone is always a nice thing. But that being said, let's go ahead and give the fingerprint scanner a try. There we go, one more time. And there we go. Real fast and responsive there, no issues at all. And again, I am glad this phone does have face unlock too, so if you want to use that instead, you always can. Now taking a look at the camera setup here, the TCL 4X 5G actually has a decent amount of features. Up front, we got a water drop notch designed for the front facing camera. This camera is 13 megapixels. Then on the back, we got a triple camera setup with a 16 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra wide camera, and a 2 megapixel macro camera. In addition to this, keep in mind that even though this phone doesn't actually have a depth sensing camera, portrait mode still does work perfectly fine. So overall, as far as the features go, this phone has pretty much everything you would expect in a non-flagship phone, including an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera, which I don't want to say it's rare in this price range, because there are plenty of entry-level phones that do have these features, but I feel like in phones under $200, and sometimes even up to $300 for that matter, don't always have both an ultra-wide camera and a macro camera, so it's definitely nice to see such an affordable phone with these features. Now when it comes to actual photo quality, this is really going to depend on what you're expecting. If you're constantly using your camera, and you want to get the best pictures you can, then honestly you might be a little disappointed here, because while on one hand, this phone does take decent photos, the quality is still going to be nothing spectacular. That being said though, for more casual camera users, if you really just need a couple nice photos here and there for social media or something like that, I do think the photo quality we're getting here is at least good enough for that kind of thing. Overall, I do think the colors and details on these photos look really good. The only thing I'm really not a big fan of here is the brightness. With this phone, some pictures tend to be a little bit overexposed or underexposed, but that being said, with the right angles and maybe if you edit things a little bit, they are going to work perfectly fine for stuff like social media. So in general, if you want to get nice pictures, but you don't need the absolute best quality ever, I do think the TCL 4X 5G will get the job done just fine. And for video, it's the same kind of thing. This phone has a max quality of 1080p in both the rear and front cameras, so we're not getting 4K here. Not that I really expected it in a $150 phone, but still definitely keep that in mind. I would say the video quality itself is at least decent. I wouldn't use this phone to record any serious videos or anything like that. So if you're making something for like YouTube or a vlog or something like that, you're probably going to want to get something a bit higher end. But for something like maybe Snapchat or Instagram, where the quality isn't really super important, I do think it will at least get the job done. Now when it comes to RAM and processor, the TCL 4X 5G is getting 4GB of RAM with the Qualcomm Snapdragon 480 5G processor. Now in general, the performance is probably the most impressive thing about this phone, especially considering, again, the full price is around $150, and I personally got it for under $100. Now sure, on one hand, compared to a really high-end device, this phone is not going to be nearly as fast, and if you're constantly going to be on your phone all day, doing stuff like high-performance mobile gaming for example, you are still going to want a faster phone, but honestly, no phone in this price range is really going to be that fast anyway, so that probably doesn't come as a surprise. But that being said, for what it is, I do think the performance we're getting here is really good, and for more basic activities like web browsing, social media, stuff like that, I do think it absolutely will get the job done. Now in case you're wondering, I did run a Geekbench 5 benchmark test on this phone, and here are the scores I got. What I recommend doing is running this test on your current phone and comparing your results to these, and that's going to give you a better idea of whether or not this phone's going to be an upgrade for you. But in general, again, in this price range, there are really not a whole lot of phones, if any, that are faster than this. So if you are looking for something really affordable that also has great performance, the TCL 4X 5G is really going to be one of your best options. Now the battery on this phone is not half bad, with a 4500 mAh battery that supports, I believe, 10W fast charging. So in general, if you're looking for a phone that has really good battery life, you're really not going to go wrong here. Sure, on one hand, it's not quite a 5000 mAh battery, and yeah, there are technically phones around this kind of price range that do have slightly better battery life, but honestly, unless you're literally looking for the absolute best, for most people, even if the battery is really important to you, this phone will be perfectly fine. And as far as the actual charging speeds go, despite only technically supporting 10W fast charging, this phone does charge up decently fast. So for the average user, unless you want something like lightning fast, which you're probably not going to find in this price range anyway, it should be fine there. And another thing I do want to point out here is that with the TCL 4X 5G, we are not getting wireless charging. I've yet to see a TCL phone that actually has that feature, so definitely keep that in mind as well. For the software, the TCL 4X 5G does have Android 11, which is a little too bad. It would have been nice to at least get Android 12, but then again, considering all the other value this phone provides for the money, I guess we can't really be too disappointed here. But that being said, if it's really important to you to have the latest version of Android, then you might want to go with something else. But in general, Android 12 does work pretty well on this phone. I mean, I haven't had any performance issues or anything. So again, unless you really care about the software that much, things do work perfectly fine on this phone. Another kind of disappointing thing with this phone is that unfortunately we're not getting NFC here. And in this day and age, at the end of 2022, going into 2023, I feel like NFC is more and more important because contactless mobile payment services are becoming more popular. And I have seen a lot of people in the comments of my other videos who see a phone not having NFC as kind of a deal breaker. So if you are one of those people, if you really like to use tap and pay, and that is an important feature for you, then keep in mind again, unfortunately the TCL 4X 5G does not have NFC, so you are probably going to want to look for a different device. Now taking a closer look at the design here, I feel like this phone has a pretty generic low-end Android look, nothing really special. The materials, while not feeling premium in any way, are at least decently solid. I mean, the phone is made entirely of plastic, except for the display of course, but again in this price range, really nothing new. So overall, despite not being anything different, in general I do think it still at least looks good. That being said though, one part of the design I'm really not a fan of is this button right here. I don't know about you, but I feel like the assistant button is one of the most unnecessary things on a phone. I mean, isn't being voice activated the whole point of the assistant anyway? Sure, on one hand, you can disable it, but even then, just having this button feels so unnecessary. I mean, if I can turn on the assistant simply by going like this, why do we need a dedicated button? And in general, in my experience, only really low-end phones have this button. So really, since we have so many other ways to get to the assistant anyway, the only thing this button really does is make the phone look and feel a little bit cheaper. But that being said, I know some people out there must like this button if manufacturers keep putting this on phones. So if you are one of those people, just keep in mind, this phone does actually have an assistant button. So if you like that feature, then it might be a good thing for you. Aside from that, the back has this kind of frosted looking material. It does sort of pick up fingerprints, but in general, it looks pretty decent. And for the most part, I feel like the majority of TCL phones look almost exactly the same on the back, so nothing really out of the ordinary here. As you can see, this phone is from TracFone, but if you have Straight Talk, I believe you can get it from them too. At the bottom here, we got the microphone, USB-C port, speaker, then we got the noise cancelling microphone and the headphone jack on the top. Nice to see this phone does have a headphone jack, because although most low-end phones do, I feel like in the future years, we're going to start seeing fewer and fewer phones, even low-end phones like this, that actually have a headphone jack. So it's definitely one of those features I feel like we have to enjoy while we can. Now, one really cool thing about this phone is that it actually has stereo audio. Now on one hand, most higher end phones do have this feature, but when it comes to more entry level phones like this, I want to say very few of them actually do. Now in case you don't know what this means, when a phone has stereo audio, that basically means when you're doing something like watching a video or playing music for example, sound is going to come out of the main speaker and the earpiece, giving you a much more immersive experience. And again, most phones in this price range aren't going to have that feature, but with the TCL 4X 5G, it actually does have stereo audio, so that was definitely a nice surprise. But I'm going to play a quick sample here to give you an idea of what it sounds like. So as you can see there, the stereo audio did work. Sure, the sound coming from the earpiece isn't nearly as good as it is with some of the higher end phones, but at least it still was there, which is more than you can say for most phones in this price range. But in conclusion, my overall thoughts about the TCL 4X 5G. Sure, on one hand, there are some features I really do wish I had, like for example NFC. That's such a basic one nowadays, and so many people use it that in my opinion, pretty much any phone in this day and age should have it. But that being said, compared to other phones in this price range, not a whole lot of them actually have NFC, so it's not really that big of a surprise anyway. Another thing is, again, I'm really not a big fan of the assistant button. I feel like this is such an unnecessary feature, and in 2022, going into 2023, I feel like this button should just be done away with permanently. But of course, that's kind of subjective, and maybe you might actually like it. And then finally, the only other thing I really don't like about this phone is that it only has Android 11, when at this point, we're transitioning into Android 13, so I feel like it should at least have Android 12. But honestly, other than that, for the price, even the major drawbacks really aren't that big a deal, because after all, you're getting a $150 phone, or even under $100 in some situations, that has 5G connectivity, the performance of a phone 3 times its price, a pretty decent amount of storage, a good camera with a ton of features, a decently nice display, and stereo audio, which again was not something I was expecting to see. So in general, if you're looking for a really affordable phone that has great performance, a good display, and plenty of features for the money, then I do think the TCL 4X 5G is definitely worth considering. But this concludes my review of the TCL 4X 5G. Again, if you want to learn more about this phone, I will be linking to several other videos about it in the description, as well as some information about pricing, availability, and some of my favorite smartphone accessories. But that's it for this video. If you enjoyed it and found it useful, be sure to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to follow Kalipa's Tech on Twitter and Instagram. And as always, I will see you in the next video.